Great. Good afternoon. Very welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. So as usual, we have an audience in the room and online. If you're joining us through Teams, you're also very welcome. Great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, well known to many people in the room, Paddy Hillyard, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology here at Queen's. Before he joined Queen's, he taught previously at Ulster and at Bristol, before taking up the chair here in 2005. His research interests are in social order and control in modern welfare states, focusing on issues including crime, social harm, political violence, poverty, and inequality. And Paddy's most recent book, which came out just towards the end of last year, in 24, is Decades of Deceit, the Stalker Affair and its Legacy, an investigation of the inquiries by the Manchester DCC John Stalker into elements of state security strategy and extrajudicial killings in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. And what Paddy does in this book is investigate the ways in which Stalker was undermined in his inquiries into these events and the continuing legacies of the Stalker Affair right the way through to the present. And that's what you're going to talk to us about today. You're going to give us an overview of the Stalker Affair and its legacy. So, Paddy, over to you.
Thank you all for coming. Obviously, a book of this size, it's going to be very difficult for me to go through much detail. But what I want to do is try and give you a flavour of some of my findings. Give an outline, first of all, about the Stalker Affair, because those of over 50 will remember it quite well. Those who are much younger won't have a clue, I don't think, about what the Stalker Affair was about. I did check online with Deceit, and although they don't mention Tiananmen Square, they do mention the Stalker Affair as being one of the most important political and policing incidents in the UK. So they're right on the ball, I think. So I'd talk a little bit about the Stalker Affair, why I decided to research the topic, and how I went about the research, and then say a little bit about some of the findings concerning Stalker's demise and his removal. And then I want to say a few words about the legacy of the Stalker Affair, because I think it's absolutely crucial to understanding current debates. It all started in 1982, when in November, a number of people were shot dead by the RUC. The first one was on the 11th of November when, following an alleged car chase, Sean Burns, Gervais McCurr and Eugene Toman were all shot dead. And in that shooting, the special squad by the RUC shot 109 bullets, which was one more than the soldiers on Bloody Sunday. Then on the 24th of November, we had the Hayshed shooting when two people were in there. The Hayshed had been used for storing explosives, and Michael Tighe was shot dead, and then Martin Macaulay was very badly wounded. And then on the 12th of November, we had the shooting of Seamus Grew and Roddy Carroll, again in a car incident. And all the killings had been carried out of the 6 young men by this RUC squad who'd been trained by the SAS in far past speed and aggression. These were preceded by an explosion in Kinleyco, where 3 police officers were blown up by the IRA, Sean Quinn, Patrick Hamilton, and Alan McCoy. And some people argued that the killing of the 6 young men was possibly a revenge killing. Nevertheless, there was considerable concern that the RUC had adopted a shoot-to-kill policy. And after a short period of time, John Stalker, who was at that stage Deputy Chief Constable, he'd just recently been appointed Deputy Chief Constable of the Greater Manchester Police, and he was asked to carry out an investigation of these 3 incidences. He was a man who was a high flyer in the police. He was a DCC at the age of 45, which was unheard of at that particular time. And he had considerable detective experience over the years and was considered a very, very good appointment for this particular job. He selected a team of officers from the GMP, and they came over here and they started their investigation. Now, the first thing pretty soon after they started their investigation, they discovered that the hay shed, which had been used for explosives, had been bugged by MI5. And they started to make demands for the tape of that shooting because they believed that if it had been bugged, it was going to be recorded, and therefore there would be a recording of the shooting. And they started to make demands for that tape and also the intelligence, because it was assumed that a number of informers had told the police about the hay shed. The demands were constantly denied, but the other thing they discovered was that there was no actual legal framework for running informers or state agents. The distinction is that an informer is somebody who's just paid for the bit of information they give. A state agent is somebody who's put on a salary, basically, and maintained as an informer. Stalker submitted his report in September 1985. So just from May 84 to September 85. Dates are very important in this particular story. Stalker was removed, having submitted his interim report, he was removed from the inquiry in May 1986, and he faced a disciplinary charge, which I always think is funny wording, of associating with known criminals in Manchester. Now, you would expect police officers to always associate with known criminals and put them under surveillance and put them before the courts. So it was a very odd wording. The decision was taken in Scarborough, and present at this meeting in Scarborough was Sir Lawrence Byford, who was at that stage head of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. Of course, it's now His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. James Anderton was present. He was this highly controversial head of the Greater Manchester Police, who made very adverse comments about gays and various other people, very controversial. And then Colin Sampson was also there, who was Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. The meeting opened with an extraordinary statement, which I still don't fully understand, but Byford said there was a need for a record of the meeting to demonstrate action without malice and duty to report. What does that actually mean? Does it suggest some sort of malice would have been present in getting rid of Stalker or not? I don't know. Interestingly, that was not recorded in the document which I found in the Public Records Office. It was only in the notes, which was presented in the civil action, which I'll talk about in a minute. The meeting decided that Stalker should face disciplinary charges and be removed forever from the Northern Ireland inquiry. And then the meeting decided that Sampson, who was party to all the information which had been given at the meeting, should conduct the disciplinary hearing against Stalker in Manchester, and he should also head up the Northern Ireland inquiry, making a connection between Manchester and Northern Ireland. And I'll come back to that connection in a minute. The police authority in Manchester rejected Sampson's recommendation that John Stalker should face disciplinary tribunal, and they immediately reinstated him in August 1986, and he continued as Chief Constable, Deputy Chief Constable in Manchester. Alongside what was happening in Northern Ireland, we have what was happening in Manchester, and in February 85, the Greater Manchester Police set up a special unit, and it was very cleverly named the Drugs Intelligence Unit, which of course would open doors if you were carrying out an investigation at banks or wherever it was. because obviously drug smugglers and the like is something that carries a particular cachet. What then happened was that it emerged that the chief suspect for the DIU was Kevin Taylor. Now, Kevin Taylor was this Manchester businessman, a very colourful character, who was a property developer. He was buying up property around Old Trafford and various other places. He had no criminal record, but his problem was that he'd been a friend of John Stalker for a number of years. They used to meet up on a few occasions. And John Stalker would invite Kevin Taylor to the officers' mess in the Greater Manchester Police and various other socials. So there were 4 crucial socials at which Kevin Taylor and John Stalker were present. Following Stalker's removal, the rumours started in Manchester that Kevin Taylor was involved in drug smuggling, and he was a member of the so-called Quality Street Gang. Now, the Quality Street Gang was a very convenient notion for the police, and I consider it was a complete myth. But however, it was a group of aging criminals who knew each other, but who now had moved out of crime and had an element of respectability about them. They'd made their money, but they'd never acted together as a gang to commit crime. What then happened was that Kevin Taylor wasn't suddenly charged with any drugs offence, but he was charged with fraud. Now, his bank made no complaint about Kevin Taylor. They were making a fortune, well, not a fortune, but they made over 300,000 in profit on his loans that they'd given him. But they made no complaint at all. It was the police who discovered the fraud. Then Kevin Taylor came up for trial in about 1990. The trial collapsed after the police had committed perjury and they'd gained access orders to his bank accounts illegally. Kevin Taylor then initiated a malicious prosecution against the Greater Manchester Police, and it was settled out of court in the end, and he was awarded £2.4 million, the greatest compensation, I think, in British policing history. So that was just very broad outline of the events. Why did I get involved? Well, I've had a long-standing interest in the rule of law. Years ago, Tom Haddon, Kevin Boyle, and I wrote a book called Law and State in Northern Ireland. And then subsequently, Tom and I got involved with looking at the diplock courts and how they operated. I also wrote a book on the Prevention of Terrorism Acts and how they were affecting the Irish community. So when Stalker was removed, to say the least, I was somewhat suspicious that here was a police officer of great credibility being removed from a very, very sensitive inquiry. So when Kevin Taylor brought the malicious prosecution against the Greater Manchester Police, I went up to the first day of the hearing, and Stalker was giving evidence. And he was absolutely vicious in terms of what he said about the various documentations. Some of it wasn't signed, others was not on reported Manchester headed note papers, and so on and so forth. So my suspicion that was something untoward here increased after I heard his evidence. What then happened was that I got very friendly with Kevin Taylor, met him quite a few times during this period that he was in court with this particular case. And he subsequently gave me access to his personal papers, and I also had access to the transcripts of the criminal trial against him and the civil action that he brought. And it's a mine of information, and it meant that one could triangulate the information in these documents. I also supplemented this with numerous interviews with a Leverhulme Foundation grant, which permitted me to interview the good and not so good, included members of the Quality Street Gang, a lifelong drug smuggler, a Northern Ireland intelligence officer, and a number of others. The only person I regret that I could never get to see and talk to was John Stalker himself, because his wife served as a gatekeeper And every time I tried to call and ask for a chat with him, she said, no, he doesn't want any more to do with it. And to some extent, one could understand it because of what he'd been through. I've also went to various interesting places, Porto-Banús, just on the coast of Costa del Sol, as I called it. This was where all the criminals from England and various other places went to live because there was no extradition treaty. A very colourful place. We even visited the Parrot Bar where Barbara Windsor used to perform on the floor. She was, of course, related to Ronnie Knight at the time, or is the girlfriend of Ronnie Knight. Went to Gibraltar, met a police officer, customs officer, who compiled a crew passenger list. I'll come back to in a minute. The research had taken many years. It wouldn't fit into any research assessment exercise, those of you who are here. So let me just give you a little bit more flavour of my findings. To understand Stalker's affair, there are two crucial events. One was the MI5 Walker report, and the other was much nearer home, called Kent Street. I would just give a few words on each. In 1981, Sir Patrick Walker was asked by, who was a senior member of MI5 at the time, was asked by John Herman to carry out a review of intelligence between the RUC and the RUC Special Branch and CID. And Walker produced this report, which was never made public, and it was implemented, and completely bypassing Parliament. We all say, Parliament is sovereign, but this report never saw the light of day until it was obtained under a Freedom of Information Act in 2001, I think it was. It was a crucial report, I think, in terms of transforming policing from the prosecution and detection of crime to intelligence gathering. Intelligence became the most important aspect of this report, and so the police and the army as well alongside were encouraged to get as many people to act as informers or state agents as possible. So when somebody was in custody, the police would say to them, well, would you prefer a long time in custody because we've found these arms on you, or will you become an informer? So it was a very, very delicate situation, but it meant that the special branch became as Stalker said, a force within a force. And it meant that the prosecution and detection of crime was downplayed. So informers and state agents were allowed to commit murder with impunity, basically. The strategy, the MI5 Walker strategy, was accompanied by a media strategy, which meant that false cover stories were put out to the press in order to make sure that informers and state agents weren't compromised at all. And so there was a level of deceit built into this particular strategy. But what was crucial, and I mentioned before, what Stalker discovered, there was just no legal framework for running agents and informers. It was completely contrary to the rule of law. The second thing to understand what actually happened in the Stalker affair was Kent Street. Do you all know Kent Street? It's just behind the library. It became the site of a long-firm fraud. Now, long-firm fraud was a common thing in the 1980s, that if you were a criminal with a little bit of money to invest, then what you did was to organize a long-firm fraud where you try to triple the amount of money you make on the initial investment through deceit. You buy up a whole load of goods and you establish your credentials, and then at the end of the day, you sell off the goods to your friends, but you also burn down your premises and you make an insurance claim. The great advantage of Northern Ireland at the time, of course, we had the Northern Ireland Criminal Compensation Fund, and that meant that you could make a claim on that. Now, there was a fellow called Mark Clappish who lived in Manchester, came across here on a Tuesday, drove around in a Rolls Royce, looked like the respectable businessman, but he wasn't. He had made over 29 claims to the Northern Ireland Criminal Compensation Board, totaling over 1.3 million. And out of that money, he was awarded 300,000 in compensation for these 29 premises that had been blown up or damaged during the early parts of the Troubles. He operated, first of all, off the Crumlin Road. Therefore, he had great connections with the Protestant community. But you'll see later, however, that it was a Catholic, the IRA, who apparently were responsible for the demise of his premises. His premises were in Kent Street, and he had a warehouse there called Cut Price Fancy Goods. Some of you may have walked past it, but it's no longer there. But the person who did all the buying of the material, which was going to be put in allegedly in this building before it was going to be blown up, was a fellow called David Burton. Now, he's critical to understanding the Stalker Affair. He's a Watermitty type character. He didn't quite know whether he was a criminal or whether he was a police officer. He was in and out of the police station all the time, trying to give them information. Most of it was untrue, but for which he was paid. He told his handler that Clappish had organised the IRA to firebomb Kent Street. And the authorities looked at Kent Street for a little while, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. But on the 26th of January, 1981, the premises were firebombed. The loss adjusters went in to see how much goods were in it because they hadn't done a very good job. But there was very little stuff in it. And so they concluded that this was a long-term fraud. But there's honor among thieves. That evening, the boys came back again and they completed the job and they completely destroyed the building. Now, what then happened was that in February 1981, there was a meeting between the RUC and the GMP in relation to Kent Street. And they shared all this intelligence about David Burton and the Quality Street gang. Now, the question is, was this intel later used in relation to Stalker? One may never know, but I think it's a fascinating question. The official narrative of Stalker's removal was that in June '84, there was sufficient intelligence on Stalker which needed to be investigated. And as he'd only just started investigating over here, he wasn't making any demands in relation to tapes or other things, and he wasn't rocking the boat. And therefore, there was no conspiracy at all. Now, the three pieces of intelligence were fascinating. One was a conversation after a game of golf between Waring, who was a painter and decorator, and McGawley, who was superintendent in the Regional Crime Squad. And McGawley said that he'd holidayed on Kevin Taylor's yacht and that John Stalker attended parties at which members of the Quality Street gang were present. And it included a man called Schiavo. Now, Schiavo owned a boat called the Shirama, and it arrived in Gibraltar also on the 11th of June with a load of wanted criminals on board. They'd just committed the biggest robbery from Security Express. None of them were oddly arrested, which surprised me. However, this was the second piece of intelligence linking the QSG to this situation. And the third piece of information was a conversation on Bridge Street between David Burton and a guy called Donnelly, who was also in the Quality Street gang. And it was a fascinating conversation. Donnelly says, my case is listed for the 7th of July, you know. And Burton says, can't your man straighten it for you? And then in brackets, Richardson, who was a police officer who took this information down, said, Burton, knowing there was a police connection inside the QSG. And then Donnelly says, who, Stalker? And Burton said, well, isn't he a top jolly now? And Donnelly says he's Jimmy Swords and Kevin's man, referring to Kevin Taylor. And Burton says, haven't you got your own man? And Donnelly said, my man's a tosser, and then mentions the name of the tosser. Anyway, I shouldn't be talking to you, Bertie. Bertie's this Burton, of course. And then it's added, B is giving evidence against the Quality Street gang re £600,000 of fraud, including IRA activities. And don't come to the pub in case you're seen by one of the lads. Now, this was central. But what was odd about the information? All these three pieces of information all occurred on the 11th of June, 1984, which made me rather suspicious to have three crucial bits of information all occurring on the same day. I then looked at each of these and tried to see whether there was anything untoward with them. And the first one, with Macaulay's original report of the golf course conversation, was missing. And there was only a copy obtained, which was discussed in the civil action. And there were several errors in it, or deliberate alterations. The Bridge Street conversation, I think, never occurred. I interviewed Donnelly, and he said it was complete fabrication. In any way, if we'd known, if I met Burton on the street, we'd have beaten him up because he'd reneged on the long-term fraud that we were involved in. Then the Gibraltar visit, there was a crew passenger list presented in the civil action, and so I tried to track down who perhaps was on this boat, and it took me to Gibraltar, it took me to Costa del Sol, Costa del Crime. It took me to a meeting in Banbridge where one of the people was going to be attending the meeting of a group of criminals down in Banbridge. In the end, a drug smuggler who was on a previous visit on this boat told me that he knew the person who had actually compiled the crew passenger list. She was a student who joined Chiavo and a group of the other friends on board as a student. And she told me that she had compiled this crew passenger list. I showed it to her, and she immediately said, that's not my writing, and it's not my spelling. She was most indignant. Yacht had been misspelled. So here was a crew passenger list to support evidence allegedly about Stalker and the QSG, etc., being submitted in a criminal action, and it was clear to me that it was a forgery. So the question that I then asked myself is, did the investigation into Stalker start in June, or was it much later? And it seemed to me the evidence was pointing to the fact that it was starting very much later. However, there was a letter at this early period between June, July 84 from Topping. I don't know if I've got time to read it out, but it's absolutely fascinating, saying that here's a group of criminals and there's a connection with the police, etc., etc. And then at the bottom it says, some weeks ago, my informant explained in an association between a senior police officer, who I will refer to as Mr. Z, i.e. Stalker, and the QSG. He was aware of a long-established corrupt police involvement with a senior member of the regional crime squad and the QSG, but was hearing from the street for the first time of a strong corrupt connection between Mr. Z, James Patrick Monaghan, and Kevin Taylor. And obviously the informant was David Burton. And what is clear, Topping says, and he was heading up the disciplinary and complaints department in Greater Manchester Police at the time. He says, what is clear is this criminal gang must be smashed, and it needs a squad of no more than 10 officers. So from that moment onwards, from his Topping's letter, there's a paucity of documentation. I won't go into all this detail, but the only action that was reported in the civil action was that Burton was interviewed no less than 11 times, 5 of these occasions by Topping. So what on earth was going on? There was no report, as it is required, about what happens with a prison visit. I must have a drink of water. Excuse me. What is surprising in this particular period, that if there was this stalker, then there was a whole discussion about the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which was about to go through Parliament, or going through Parliament at the time, and it established a new procedure for disciplinary action against senior officers. And it's surprising, therefore, that Anderton, as head of the GMP, didn't refer Stalker to the Police Complaints Authority as required. And I've discovered that Anderton only started taking notes about Stalker in May 1985. Earlier on, there was nothing at all that came in. Now, the DIU, this Drugs Intelligence Unit, was set up in February 85. It was very top heavy, and it was clear that it was going to investigate Stalker. And what was interesting, Stalker was never informed, as the Deputy Chief Constable, that this body had been set up. And it was obviously designed to investigate the Taylor-Stalker relationships. And so the first thing that happened was that they interviewed David Burton on 5 occasions, from the 7th, 14th, 21st, 26th of February and the 7th of March. And they tape recorded him. And the tape recorder was turned on and off against all police practices, and there was evidence of considerable prompting. So one doesn't know to what extent Burton was being given information in order to consolidate what has already been happening, or whether or not he was presenting new information. But then one of the incredible things that happened was that Burton died a week later at the age of 40. And many people considered that this was highly suspicious. But the epitaph on his tombstone said this: deeply mourned by devoted mother, uncle, aunts, relatives and friends. And the bottom line I loved: truly, too sadly missed to be forgotten. And crucially, David Burton hasn't been forgotten, because he was absolutely key to the Stalker Affair. Topping, in March 1985, writes another letter. You remember the one I've told you about early on, the 17th of July 84, substantiating what he thought he had found. He says, "Sir, brief notes to update you in relation to Taylor and Febb." You'd notice that Febb is now the name for Stalker, whereas before it was Z. Why it should have changed, I don't know. Much of the information is yet to be tested, of course, and an in-depth study of Taylor's background is currently underway. A great deal is now known about the other key members of the QFG, but I have not yet decided our line of attack. And you will remember that he had decided his line of attack already, and he said that the Quality Street gang should be smashed. Whereas again, now he's saying he's not sure of his line of attack, which is most odd. But also this is 9 months after the alleged intelligence on Stalker in June 84. And nothing seems to have happened in the meantime, but he's now talking about it currently is underway. So it contradicts what had happened already. The brief notes was another factor. They weren't brief notes. And what was interesting, it was only a few points on his letter, but then there were 2 blank pages with all these items, 10 items relating to Kevin Taylor and Febb, as it was called, headed, and then there were 25 items relating to Kevin Taylor. And most of the items in both these documents that were on these plain bits of paper were provided by David Burton. So the conclusion that I reached in terms of the period June 84 to February 85 was that the golf course was genuine, but there was strong evidence suggests that the other documentation was created later. Why? to simply suggest that the start of the investigation in Stalker was in fact not in June 1984. Well, it had been put in there in order to suggest that it had started in June 84, and therefore confirms the official narrative, when in fact that it was much later when John Stalker was making demands. And there's further support, I would argue, for this conclusion, because oddly enough, Topping's diaries, he was central in terms of setting up the the DIU and the earlier intelligence. His diaries are now missing. They couldn't be found, as to a blue book in which Richardson, who was Burton's handler, apparently kept a record of all their meetings. So again, it just increases one's suspicion of what actually happened. From then onwards, from the beginning of 85, the end of 84 onwards, there were two parallel sets of investigation. Stalker was making constant demands of MI5 for the tape. In June 85, he had January 85, he had a meeting with them. 6 months later, he had another meeting with them. And on each occasion, MI5 said they wouldn't stand in their way, and they agreed to cooperate. But now, as we all know, the copy of the tape which they had, they destroyed, of the HT shooting, as did the RUC. So there was no way they were going to cooperate. They didn't tell Stalker that the tapes had already been destroyed. So Stalker in September 85 produces an interim report in the absence of the tape and the intelligence he was demanding. And Herman then delays for 9 months, nearly 9 months, I think it was, sending the report to the, sorry, that should be the DPP, not the DTP. And he eventually sends it to the DPP in February 86, delaying any sort of action in relation to the report. And then he wanted to interview under caution Jack Herman, the head of the RUC, the head of the ACC, and the head of Special Branch. A very, very serious set of interviews which he wished to carry out. But before he was able to do that, he was removed. And then you have the other element back in Manchester, where you have the DIU interviewing Burton. You then have the appointment of a fraud specialist to the DIU. There's huge pressure on the banks and numerous interviews with Kevin Taylor's friends and enemies. And then in September 85, and this, of course, was the moment at which Stalker had submitted his report, the DIU launched Operation Kaluki. Now, Operation Kaluki involved 114-day surveillance of Kevin Taylor's offices. At this time, the Greater Manchester Police had one of the highest crime rates in the country. And here was a unit, top-heavy unit of senior officers looking at an office for 114 days from across the road. How one can explain that use of resource other than something very devious was going on is very hard, I think. We then have Anderton asking the DIU to prepare a report. They prepare a report in May 1986. Anderton takes this to Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, a man called Myers, and the last sentence, or nearly the last sentence in this report, saying some people might have reason to believe that Stalker was sympathetic to the IRA. So in other words, that the information that Burton had provided, suggesting that the Kent Street was carried out by the IRA, I think there's probably more evidence that it was carried out by loyalists because of Clappish's connection to that community. Yet here is going down through various police reports and going down into this particular report, which then led to Stalker's demise. A very serious allegation to say that he was sympathetic to the IRA. So what I conclude is that series of events were so paralleled that it appeared that Stalker's investigation in Northern Ireland was triggering what happened in Manchester, and it intensified it. And there was also a determination to get Taylor, to prosecute Taylor, because then it could be argued that there is a connection between Taylor and the Quality Street gang and his criminality, and therefore it would substantiate the charge against Stalker that he was associating with known criminals. So that, very briefly, it gives you some flavour of my conclusions in relation to what happened in terms of John Stalker. But crucially, I argue that the failure to address the concerns which Stalker raised, particularly in relation to the fact there was no rule of law, no framework governing the activities of informers and state agents, was something that needed to be changed. And if Stalker and Sampson's, subsequently some of Sampson's recommendations had been acted upon, and there had been changes in MI5's Walker security strategy, that many lives could have been saved. But all the way from that moment onwards, one could see the way in which the authorities used all sorts of different methods to prevent disclosure of the strategy. In January 1988, which wasn't a great month for British justice and the rule of law, the Court of Appeal held that the Birmingham 6 convictions were in fact safe and satisfactory. And as we all know, the Birmingham 6 were eventually released as one of the biggest miscarriages of justice. But then 3 days later, the Attorney General announced that, that he had reached a decision in relation to the Stalker-Sampson's recommendations in terms of the shootings that I described earlier on. And he said that the DPP in Northern Ireland had concluded, and this is, I find, quite shocking, that there is evidence of commission of offences of perverting the course of justice, or attempting or conspiring to pervert the course of justice, or of obstructing a constable in the execution of his duty, and that this evidence is sufficient to require consideration of whether prosecutions are required in the public interest. And he had consulted me accordingly. But the Attorney General then said he's decided, in regard to the public interest, it would not be proper to initiate proceedings. In other words, that police officers who had been instructed to tell lies as a result of the strategy, the MI5 Walker strategy, and they were perverting the course of justice, it wasn't in the public interest for that to become public knowledge through prosecutions. And of course, that decision of the Attorney General proved extremely fatal for many people in Northern Ireland. One of the first, just a year later, on the 12th of February 1989, the Belfast solicitor Pat Finucane was murdered in front of his family by loyalists while he was eating Sunday lunch. Pat Finucane had been very successful to challenge the law, and was seen by the authorities as a thorn in their side. He represented Eleanor McCurr, who was the widow of Gervase McCurr, and during one of the early inquests in relation to those killings, he took judicial review of the coroner's decision not to admit the unsworn statements of police officers. He wanted police to give evidence, not just simply admit unsworn statements. The family have made constant demands for a public inquiry, and Geraldine Finucane, the wife, has applied to the European Court for Human Rights for a proper investigation. And then in May 1999, the RUC appointed Stevens, who had already carried out a number of two other inquiries here, to investigate the murder. That was Stevens 3. And then in 2001, the government agreed to a public inquiry if recommended by an independent judge, and that independent judge, Judge Quarry, did recommend a public inquiry, but the British government governments constantly refused to hold a public inquiry, and it's not only, and hence they delayed and delayed any more information about MI5's security strategy becoming knowledge. And in October 2011, the family were called to Downing Street, and Cameron told them that there would be no public inquiry held, only a desktop review by a man called De Silva. And at the time, Cameron said there were forces around here that will not allow it to happen. It was obviously a clear reference to MI5. The public inquiry, as some of you may know, has recently been announced last September by the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. But that was an opportunity for more information to come out, but it wasn't. Stephen Shreve, looking at some of the detail there, that the British Army had set up an intelligence officer in the UDA, and they were feeding this man, Brian Nelson, with documentation of people who were considered to be members of the IRA. The British Army actually did that. And there was a possibility that more information would have come out if Brian Nelson was prosecuted. But there was a big debate among the authorities about whether or not he should be prosecuted. There was huge opposition from MOD, which is hardly surprising, Ministry of Defence, because they'd actually set up Brian Nelson as an intelligence officer. They argued that it would challenge the integrity of the system by revealing that Nelson was not merely a paid informant, but a long-term agent who was allowed to continue as an active member of a terrorist organisation which committed many murders while he was acting as its intelligence officer. It would feed the speculation that those who believe that the security forces are involved in a dirty tricks campaign and are in collusion with loyalist paramilitary groups. Exactly, that's exactly what would happen. It was also opposed by Patrick Walker, who was the architect of this deadly MI5 strategy, which had no legal framework. And he argued it would damage the morale of state agents, and MI5 officials might be subject to kidnap. As it was, Nelson pleaded guilty, and hence there was no trial of his behaviour, and hence, again, no information emerging publicly about the MI5 Stalker strategy. De Silva carried out his desktop review in relation to Finucane's murder, and it makes shocking reading. But he concluded, and my overall conclusion is that it was a willful and abject failure by successive governments to provide the clear policy and legal framework necessary for agent handling operations to take place effectively and within the law. And then Cameron, having received this report, makes this very, very damning statement in Parliament. It's a shame, I think, on the authorities and those who've been in charge all of this time, when he finds that with state collusion, there was a series of positive actions by employees of the state actively furthered and facilitated Finucane's murder. There were extensive leaks of security force information to the UDA and other loyalist groups, an extraordinary state of affairs in which both the Army and the RUC Special Branch had prior knowledge of a series of pan-UDA assassinations, yet nothing was done by the RUC to seek to prevent these attacks. It's really shocking that this happened in our country. State agents played key roles in the Special Branch too. 2 agents were at the time in the pay of the state were involved. The RUC Special Branch 2 were responsible for seriously obstructing the investigation. And most shocking of all, Sir Denson says that on the balance of probability, an RUC officer or officers did propose Pat Finucane as a UDA target while speaking to a loyalist paramilitary. One couldn't find a more damning statement, I don't think. The last point that I want to make is about the Legacy Act. I'm convinced that the real origin of that is to prevent any more information appearing about the MI5 strategy. And I considered it abolishes basically the rule of law for the period of the conflict. And it means that the argument that has been put out in public, that the reason why we got this Legacy Act introduced by the Tory government was to stop any further prosecutions of soldiers in relation to the conflict. But I don't think it's that level. The British state has never really been concerned about low-lying fruit being prosecuted, as one may say, in terms of police officers or soldiers. The real issue, I believe, is to prevent those people who devise the strategy, the civil servants who were told to go slow in terms of implementing a legal framework, developing a legal framework for running of state agents and informers, and those who committed perjury, committed perverting the course of justice at the very highest level, are going to be saved from any form of prosecution or from the rule of law. It seems to me that that is the real reason why the Legacy Act was introduced, over which there is currently so much controversy. And it means, of course, that in the end, victims of the strategy, because of claims to national security and the fact that there is a principle of neither confirm nor deny whether a state agent or employee of the state was involved in their murder, they will never now know whether somebody was involved. My overall conclusion is that the Stalker Affair raised serious concerns about the rule of law, accountability and transparency, and it leaves lasting questions about the invisible power of MI5 during the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. You're happy to take some questions?
Yes, yeah.
I take it. Great. Okay, so people in the room, just raise your hand to ask a question. People joining us online, if you kind of click the digital hand on your screen, then Becca will let us know that you want to ask a question. So we would like to start.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Paddy, for an expert guide to that very elaborate series of developments. Now, could you tell me why? What was the official reason for removing Stalker from the inquiry in the first instance?
What was the official reason?
Right. When he was told that you are no longer to continue with this, you're to be removed from this inquiry, he presumably asked why, and they said what? What was the,
well, the argument was presented to him by Sampson during the disciplinary hearing.
yeah.
That first of all, that he was given a very broad outline that he was associating known criminals,
Right.
but then as the inquiry progressed, a new charge was introduced, which was using official cars for personal use. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, I do find that, that's why I wanted to get it straight as well. I find that aspect of it
This is
very,
what,
very upset,
yeah.
really extraordinary.
yeah, this is why the police authorities just threw it out.
Yes.
They thought it was quite extraordinary that, you know, and if anybody wants enjoyable reading, they should read the Sampson report on the disciplinary hearing. It's the most incoherent, contradictory report that I've ever read of a police investigation. Police investigations don't normally get aired, but this one was leaked to the press in about May or June 1986, and it's quite incredible. I mean, it's contradictory. It's got dates wrong. Information is incorrect, and this was the disciplinary hearing in relation to Stalker. We don't have Sampson's report on Northern Ireland, which he continued after Stalker was here.
Thank you.
Yes, the back.
Thank you very much. It was really fascinating. Experts for talk. It's such a, I discovered so much in all that. I don't want to ask a general question around on your expertise in terms of what level, there's two different parts. I think, to what extent was there sort of a coherency at the heart of these type of actions, and to what extent was the responsibility being sort of exercised? And by that I mean, did all elements of the security apparatus know necessarily what the other ones were up to? Were like how were shared with the shoot to kill policy, for example? Who was developed by, who was signed off by, or who just not know that? Is that too sort of murky? I mean, and that's what goes into the responsibility question, because you also imagine, especially in the 70s, 80s, for example, the RUC, not like an MI5 necessarily taking over their operation. As sort of a set of territorialities of between the British Army, say, Special Branch and RUC, these different actors might not see things exactly the same way, and they might not be taking orders from the same people. So, to what level is there coherence, and to what level sort of can be pinpoint responsibility or the origination of these different strategies? Is it an MI5 and then subsequently signed off or not by a politician or a civil servant?
I mean that's very hard to get at, I think, because so much was never written down, well, made public anyway. The MI5 Walker strategy, as I was pointing out, was never published until much later on. I mean, after the conflict finished, and so one doesn't get a glimpse into any of the decisions which were being made. I mean, one of the points that I didn't cover, but I think is very relevant, is that John Boucher spent 40 million investigating the case of Steak Knife, who was a golden egg, as he referred to, and he was unable to get any of the recommendations which he put forward for prosecutions in relation to Steak Knife. Now, I believe that was deliberate. It was a deliberate part of the MI5 Walker strategy, that lawyers sat down when they were devising it and saying, look, we know that intelligence cannot be used to prosecute people in criminal courts because it's hearsay, or it may be just something that somebody has said from the street and we've noted it down. And I would like to see the deliberations of that strategy, because I think that after Boucher tried to recommend prosecutions, the Director of Public Prosecutions comes along and says, look, we can't use any of this intelligence. I believe that was part of the very strategy. So if one could see that, the minutes of those lawyers sitting down in MI5 devising this strategy of using informers and state agents, knowing full well that nobody could be prosecuted, would be absolutely fascinating. It may be that the public inquiry into Finucane's murder may go down that line, and we may get some further, people will be interrogated and cross-examined on that particular aspect, because we spent 40 million without any impact at all, other than some families receiving some reports in relation to Steak Knife, who, by the way, was responsible for over 40 murders. And my calculations from the police inquiries and court cases and the like, 160, just 4 informers, 3 on the in the UDA, 1 in the IRA, they were responsible for over 160 murders. They were involved in over 160 murders. That's the extent to which the MI5 strategy led to so much death.
Yes.
Did MI6 have a role?
Well, they did initially, but in the early 70s, but then MI5 took over. So MI6 is overseas responsibility, MI5 is domestic.
Any questions online, Becca?
No.
So far? Yes.
Paddy, can you speak a wee bit to the context of what was known and what was discussed contemporaneously in the press? I have a kind of a memory that investigative journalism and so on was better in this era than it is now. And was much investigated at the time?
That's a fascinating question. You're absolutely right. There was enormous investigation, and right the way across the British press, the right wing and the more serious, all were suggesting perhaps there was some conspiracy to remove Stalker. The Star Roundup headline, MI5 remove Stalker, or words to that effect. But yes, I mean, there was enormous investigations going on, particularly by David Lee, who subsequently moved on to the post office scandal. He along with a number of other Observer journalists, did enormous work. And for example, Paul Lashmer, the Observer, managed to get all the details about Clappish's claims to the Northern Ireland Compensation Board. I mean, so, you know, I relied heavily on some of that newspaper reporting, but it really was excellent in 1986.
Paddy, there was the strange business with Peter Taylor, which was the closing as a kind of investigation that appeared to sort of attempt to confirm that there was something to the story about Kevin Taylor boat and all the rest of it.
Yeah, Peter Taylor, very interestingly, argues that there was no conspiracy. He produced a television program about Taylor's boat being used for drug smuggling. I investigated that, and it was coincidental. It took place. What actually happened was that Kevin Taylor was trying to sell his boat, and as part of that, the way you sell a boat, apparently you allow it to go on a proving trip if people wanted to buy it. And what was happening at the time was very unfortunate for Taylor, because drug smugglers realized this was a great way to avoid detection. You borrow somebody's boat and you fill it up with drugs in North Africa, and you bring it across to Dartmouth, as it was the case with Kevin Taylor's boat. And you then put the onus on the owner of the boat rather than yourself as a drug smuggler. And a number of boats had been used for this during this period, including Kevin Taylor's. So, you know, Peter Taylor then had this panorama program implying that Taylor was involved in drug smuggling, but it was very, very convenient in terms of what subsequently conspired, because it made it look as though Taylor was very much involved. I've spoken to him a number of times about drugs, and I know full well that he had 2 young daughters at the time, and there was no way that he would have been involved in drug smuggling. And so I think that was a very bad bit of journalism, because it did what the police wanted to do, was to have information out in the public that there was some strong basis for investigating Stalker. And for me, it was just simply a coincidence, which was not that relevant, but extremely relevant for the police.
Okay.
It's fascinating, and I'm very conscious, because the neighbours all heard by MI5, the story just recently, you know, about X and the wife beater, the Nazi photography. It was covered up,
yeah.
You know, and the fact that the head of MI5 contacted the Director General of the BBC and said, you know, the journalist was exposing it was lying, whereas obviously he wasn't. So it's still obviously very much in play. My question is, in relation to your research and that whole lengthy process of doing it, and why it's different to that of a journalist or indeed of an historian. And so and obviously slightly self-interested here, with a question about the role of sociology in this. So what is it about this study that you've brought as a sociologist that makes it different to maybe a different type of study that would have been written by a historian?
That's a fascinating question. I suppose, you know, having had an interest in the sociology of law for so long, it seemed to me that this was a classic area which one needed to get involved and talk about it, because ultimately the sociological question is, how is power operated in a modern state when it's faced by a conflict situation? And for me, it highlights very well the way in which the invisible power of MI5 operated through this whole period. MI5 not accountable in any real sense. It is able to turn to politicians and in some senses, I believe now, over the debate over the legacy, it's still saying, look, keep the commission. This is what we need. We don't want any further police investigations and so on. So that invisible hand of MI5 is something which I think a sociologist picks up, whereas lawyers would be thinking about the detail of the law. Historians would hopefully pick up on the work that's been done in terms of raising the debate about the illegality of what went on. It wasn't until 2021 that the British government introduced a legal framework for running informers and agents. But at that time, they extended the power for organizations to use it, use agents and state agents beyond the army and the police to 9 other organizations. So your Food Standard Agency now can use spies. Yes.
Has there been any official reaction to your book? I'm talking about government reaction, different bodies. How have they responded? Have they done it at all?
Not that I know of. I know that Hilary Benn has got a copy of it. It was put into his hands by a friend. I also know that John Boucher has got a copy, but I haven't heard either of their views of it, and I haven't heard views from anybody else.
So it has just all really gone very quiet.
Yeah, very quiet. But Katie, just go back to your point about you were raising the fact that MI5 recently was shown to have lied in court. Only a few months ago, Manny Buller, who was head of MI5, appeared on the the podcast, Campbell and Stewart, and she said about the steak knife operation. Said we would never have that was very bad. We would never have handled that like it was handled. Which was complete rewriting of history, because MI5, throughout that whole period that Steak Knife was operating from Army headquarters, they had an officer, MI5 had an officer looking at all intelligence coming in from Steak Knife in police headquarters. So she actually lied or wasn't informed in that particular program.
After Stalker was stood down or misuse of cars or for whatever reason, and then there were some further reviews commissioned. What is the status of those original murders today?
What happened was that the police officers involved in the in relation to the McCurr case, one police officer was brought before the court, and then in terms of the other one in the counter, a number of officers were also brought, but each time they were acquitted. Probably quite rightly, I think, because they were acting on the belief there was all this intelligence about these people, who were involved, and hence that it's very hard to prove that they were intent on murder. And in one of the cases, there was a highly controversial statement by Gibson, the judge, who said that they'd come to their final court of justice.
So the matter is.
Yeah, but what I'm more interested in is why there hasn't been any prosecution for perverting the course of justice by senior officers within the RUC. I mean, most of them were retired or dead by now, but I mean, that was the Attorney General's decision, that none of those people who had been responsible for devising the strategy and telling people that this is the intelligence, etc., that we've got, and this is how you've got to act. I mean, it's at a higher level that I think it is so important that there's been no form of justice at all. And also all the handlers of these informers acting out beyond the law.
Is this still happening?
I mean, I'd worry, because I still think the MI5 is a completely unaccountable organisation. I mean, it's a secret state operating, telling lies for the, and always able to hide behind the notion of national interest or public interest. I mean, that statement that I read out from the Attorney General in 1988, I find was completely disgraceful. You know, there was evidence that they'd were responsible for perverting the course of justice, but decided it wasn't in the public interest. Quite extraordinary. And talking to young lawyers, for example, a DU, a future director of public prosecution, told me that he found as a young lawyer that statement completely upsetting, and the fact that he believed in the rule of law, and here was the Attorney General saying, get stuffed. Bryce, I thought you want.
Your book is fascinating and brilliantly researched, Paddy, and I applaud you for all of that.
Is it about
others feel confronted with the kind of unrest that was in Northern Ireland would have acted differently? Sadly, I think they probably wouldn't. I think the Irish government has secrets to hide. The American government has secrets to hide. All over the world, states don't want to watch their government in public. If there are guidelines in other countries, such as have recently been put in place, as you said, in 2021, on the handling of informants, I don't know of them. Do you know of, are there any other countries that have such guidelines?
I don't. I mean, I haven't looked into that, and I agree with you. I mean, I think that there probably would be no other state faced with the level of communal violence that there was would have done anything differently. But my problem is that if you had a system of accountability which was independent of those making the decisions, one could have had a discussion about whether or not the strategy would work. And John Boucher, in his Canova report, in relation to State Knife, says that the view that it saved many lives, or State Knife saved many lives as a result of the intelligence he produced, was simply wrong. He said you could count the number of lives on one hand that that strategy produced. So if you have an independent system of accountability who could query that strategy and look at the evidence and say, look, this isn't working. People have been, you're allowing these informers and state agents to commit murder for what? You prevented a number of explosions, perhaps, but you haven't prevented this death or that death. So for me, the rule of law is so important, and just particularly in those sorts of contexts. And as somebody said, the rule of law in Northern Ireland yielded a rule of law, rule of war.
It would be possible to argue, but I'll answer the previous one, that since those, as it were, on the ground, many of them anyway, were aware that what was going on officially was simply a tissue of lies, and the state agents were committing murder, and the state was excusing this where it wasn't organising it. Would it be reasonable to assume that this was so counterproductive that it actually prolonged the troubles rather than cut them short?
I mean, my argument would be that certainly. I believe it did prolong the troubles. No doubt about it.
Contrary to that, I mean, there is evidence that the IRA in particular was affected by this policy of ambush, if you like.
Yeah.
We have the example, I know just the other day or two. The IRA reduced its operations because they were losing so many people who were murdered by the security forces. So, you know, the army and the police would probably say, the MI5 would probably say, well, to an extent it worked. We saved lives, which otherwise would have been lost. That's a counterfactual that we can never answer, of course. That would be their kind of justification for it, unfortunately.
Absolutely. But I think that, you know, it would have been possible if one had access to all the information at the time to look at that quite critically and say, well, you know, what is actually happening? And as we know, what the IRA did was that they tried to look for the informers, which were, and therefore a large number of the, I mean, at least 40 were killed by Scappaticci. We don't know, you know, whether they were informers or not, but the IRA believed them to be informers. So you then had that development, and you also had the IRA taking further action in terms of having small cells and not passing on information and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult, isn't it, in terms of knowing what the impact would have been. But my point is that, you know, just having some sort of accountability under the rule of law would have meant that one could have interrogated that strategy rather than letting MI5 run it and the top echelons of the police to run it as though this was winning the war.
Paddy, do you have a sense, or is it possible to say whether the current review of the Legacy Act under the new government, which of course is headed by a former DPP, is likely to shift policy at all on dealing with the legacy of the specific legacies that you've been addressing in this book? I mean, is that over-optimistic to anticipate?
Well, I mean, Bryce and I would have different views, I think. I mean, I think it's best that the Legacy Act doesn't maintain the commission. I think we need to go back to the Storm and House Agreement policy. But I think it's debatable. I mean, you know, the courts, what's interesting, I think, is the courts have taken a very strong stand recently in relation to legacy. And I don't know how one explains that as a sociologist, but I think it's probably a new generation of lawyers coming through who've said that, you know, we've had enough of the British government determining what is happening. We're going to enforce the rule of law within Northern Ireland. And so I'm not sure what the British government will do in relation to legacy, but I know from the majority of victims that they don't have any trust in the new commission, principally because the people who are carrying out the investigations cannot be seen as totally independent. And secondly, that the fact that that in the existing legislation, whether it would be changed or not, the notion of sensitive documentation or sensitivity of documents will give the Secretary of State currently the power to determine what can be omitted and what isn't omitted. My view is that you've got to change the whole policy of neither confirm nor deny, and have, obviously there's certain things that shouldn't be in the public domain if it threatens life or whatever. But after 30 years or more, I cannot see why you cannot allow much more information to be given to the families. And knowing that, the track record of deceit of MI5, and the fact that even with Boucher, we know that documents were subsequently found well after he submitted his report on Canova. There is so much lacking trust in the new commission that I think that we've got to go back to Stormont House Agreement. But Bryce, you take a different view.
Well, I do. I'm a member of the commission, as you probably know.
Oh, yeah.
Not non-executive.
No.
Member of the board. And I joined it because I believe basically that the best way of recovering information for the families and survivors is to offer some incentive to people who did bad things, and I include the state in that group, come forward and provide information, knowing that they will suffer no adverse consequences as a result. That might sound harsh to many victims, but in general, I believe more victims will get more information if you adopt that kind of strategy than if you prosecute Soldier F or Bloody Sunday or adding somebody from the IRA. And these were all cogs in wheels, these people, by and large. And what we need is a truth recovery process first and foremost, not putting as much emphasis as we have in the past on the justice approach, because it doesn't provide information of an adequate quality and quantity. That's my general belief. And the powers of the commission are as extensive as those of judges who run public inquiries. I mean, the Pat Finucane family, for whom I have the greatest sympathy, have accepted a public inquiry. But they must know that under the Inquiries Act of 2005, a minister can also censor what the head of that inquiry allows to be published.
But the key point is that people could be cross-examined in public.
Yes.
And that's the essence of a public inquiry. Whereas, I mean, how much can the new commission actually cross-examine people in public in order to give it credibility?
First and foremost, the tribunal inquiry doesn't exactly cross-examine people in the way that a criminal court would. It examines people and allows other people to put questions to them, but the rules of evidence are different. But also the part of the commission, as it was set up, and I totally agree with you that it has terrible origins. It was set up by the Boris Johnson government, by and large, to protect veterans. But we must move on from that and see what the real powers of the commission are. And they include all the powers that a coroner has, and lots of the powers that a chair of a tribunal inquiry has. The Act does not expressly say that the commission cannot hold hearings in public, but it doesn't prevent it either. And I know that Declan Morgan is, former Lord Chief Justice, very, very committed to public hearings. He was keen, and is keen still, to test the law as to whether the commission can hold public hearings. And it would be a brave person who would come along and say, no, you can't. And a court, given that you say activism of our current judges, somebody was saying that, I think judges here would, if asked, allow the commission to hold hearings in public. But I think Hilary Benn's Act, forthcoming bill anyway, will allow for the inclusion of public hearings expressly in the Act provisions. And the commission, I hear what you say about getting rid of it, but it's up and running. Over 120 people have come to it already. There are 26 or so investigations running. Who are we to tell those people that come to the commission, no, that's not going to stop now. They have nothing to lose. Nobody has anything to lose by coming to the commission, because even if they don't get satisfaction, the if they don't get satisfaction, they can try other outlets, such as the inquest, such as inquiries.
Good. Thank you, Bryce. Adrian?
Sorry, if I could see, well, there's sort of slightly in the tangent of this, but I mean, it follows on from your general remarks about the rule of law, Paddy, which is the strange story about the refusal to sponsor Afghan soldiers who helped British forces in Afghanistan on the grounds, apparently, that if they were allowed to arrive in Britain, they'd be able to give evidence of wrongdoing by the soldiers. So that seems to be the fear behind not allowing these people to come to the UK. I mean, it's a very bizarre story. I don't know if you've seen the story,
No.
but it's a very bizarre story relating to what went on in Afghanistan with the same, strange elements to it of some of your kind of stuff as well.
Fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, if you haven't seen the story, you
No.
haven't seen the story. Sorry.
I've only seen Forgotten.
Okay.
It's a TV series, which is well worth looking at in terms
This
of
is
Afghan.
the recent news story about the fact that the British Army won't sponsor the settlement of Afghans who've applied for coming as refugees on the basis that apparently that they're scared, that there are concerns about what they might testify to. I mean, it seems a very odd basis for refusing people settling here. Yeah, sorry, that is very much in the
Great. Rebecca, nothing online? Good. Okay, I think as we all do. So just a reminder, Paddy's book, Decades of Deceit, Stalker Affair and Its Legacy, is available in paperback at a reasonable price.
No, not a reasonable, very cheap price.
Extremely reasonable price.
500 pages. Tell me an academic book of 500 pages is not 180 quid.
And this is something that beyond the pale I've been aiming to do, is to make important research accessible and available to people. So Paddy's book is available in all good bookstores, including No Alibis around the corner. I think it just leaves us to thank Paddy for coming and setting out what the key arguments of the book are, giving us a very clear sense of the outcomes of years of research into this extremely important and highly controversial subject of the Stalker Affair. So thank you again, Paddy, for coming on. Just before people go, we've no seminar next week. In 2 weeks' time, on the 3rd of February, we have Tiffany Thompson, who is our Boston College PhD exchange student for this year, coming to speak on the 3rd of March. She'll be speaking about women's experience of the conflict, the outbreak of conflict in Northern Ireland in 1969. So please come and join us then and hear what she has to say on that subject.
Thank you.